On the 18th of September 1914, the Third Home Rule Bill became the Government of Ireland Act 1914, and in the House of Commons John Redmond lauded that fact. It had been the achievement of a 4-decade-long nationalist struggle. After that point, John Redmond immediately made his way back to Ireland, through Holyhead, through Dublin, and then progressing down to South Wicklow. And as he moved to his country residence at Aughvanna, not too far from here, he stopped to meet a group of volunteers, the assemblage of 5 units of infantry and 1 unit of cavalry, the East Wicklow Volunteers, that were stationed here for an inspection at Woodenbridge in what is now a golf course. Later in his career, South Wicklow would become a place that would isolate John Redmond from the realities of Irish politics, and many of his colleagues and contemporaries such as John Dillon would be much more in tune with the rapidly changing pace of public opinion, particularly in Dublin. On the 20th September 1914, John Redmond came here to meet with the assembled units of the East Wicklow Volunteers at Woodenbridge, County Wicklow. He took that opportunity to address the assembled volunteers, and he used it to enunciate a deviation from his previous policy. Up to that point, John Redmond had pledged the volunteers for home defence. This had been a policy that he had first enunciated on the 3rd of August 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. After the Home Rule Bill became law, John Redmond had to make good on his promise to extend his pledge of home support to a call to the Irish volunteers to go further in their action and actually enlist in the British Army for service overseas. When he arrived at Woodenbridge, if we're to believe his biographers and the propaganda at the time, this was an impromptu meeting. However, Woodenbridge is 20 kilometres from Redmond's home in Aughvanna, and it's actually further south than his country home. So this was very much a planned operation. He stopped here and he addressed the volunteers. First thing he said to them was that he didn't intend to make a speech, but this was anything but the case. John Redmond very clearly made one of the most important political speeches of his career at Woodenbridge in September 1914. He told the assembled volunteers that the Great War in which they were now participating was a war for civilization and a war for the rights of small nations in Europe.
The interests of Ireland, of the whole of Ireland, are at stake in this war. This war is undertaken in the defence of the highest principles of religion and morality and right, and it will be a disgrace forever to our country and a reproach to our manhood and a denial of the lessons of our history if young Ireland confine their efforts to remaining at home to defend the shores of Ireland from an unlikely invasion, and to shrinking from the duty of proving on the field of battle that gallantry and courage which has distinguished our race all through its history. I say to you, therefore, your duty is twofold. I am glad to see such magnificent material for soldiers around me, and I say to you, go on drilling and make yourselves efficient for the work, and then account yourselves as men, not only for Ireland itself, but wherever the firing line extends, in defence of right, of freedom and religion in this war.
Redmond's initial announcement of the pledge of the volunteers for home defence had been done as a solo run, without consultation of his political colleagues or the Provisional Committee of the Irish Volunteers. This was a significant factor, and Woodenbridge signified both an extension of that policy and also a further deviation from Redmond's career-long model of collegiate government. This was a solo run yet again, just like the beginning of August. And with the Woodenbridge speech, he angered many of his parliamentary colleagues. John Dillon entered into an estrangement with Redmond for a period after this, and there was very much a split in the highest echelons of the Irish Parliamentary Party. For a long time since the summer, when Redmond had parachuted in his 25 nominees onto the Provisional Committee of the Irish Volunteers, they had chafed against the role that the Irish Parliamentary Party had in moderating and changing the policy of the Irish Volunteers from its founding principles. They used Woodenbridge, therefore, as a key opportunity to reassert their dominance within the Irish volunteer movement. The immediate result of the Woodenbridge speech was an announcement of a new policy by the original Provisional Committee of the Irish Volunteers. The Provisional Committee split on the 25th of September 1914, and from that point onwards there were two volunteer movements within nationalist Ireland. The original Irish Volunteer Provisional Committee, which had existed since November of 1913, retained the title of Irish Volunteers, and they kept the torch burning of the original founding principles of the Irish Volunteers. Redmond appropriately took the title of National Volunteers, and this new nationalist force took the majority of the rank and file of the volunteers. The split was roughly 93% in favour of Redmond and 7% in favour of Owen MacNeill's Irish Volunteers. Despite this, the key leading figures, Bulmer Hobson, the O'Rahilly, Owen MacNeill, Pádraig Pearse, they stayed in the Irish Volunteers. And here we see the genesis of that minority of a minority who went out and fought in Easter week 1916, appearing in the autumn of 1914. To say that John Redmond's Woodenbridge speech was controversial is perhaps an understatement. Not only did it change and undermine the relationship he had with John Dillon in the leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party, it also changed the role and relationship he had with the Provisional Committee of the Irish Volunteers. John Redmond's policy also appeared to him to solve the Ulster question. He believed he would steamroll any question of Sinn Féin dissent against his leadership in one fell swoop, because now the question of Ulster had been solved, and as Green and Orange were planned to bleed as one in the trenches and forge a new nation-founding narrative of the Irish state through service in the First World War, then Woodenbridge was for him to be a key triumph. However, Redmond didn't bank on several key factors, including the longevity of the war and the ultimate failure for the Home Rule Bill to become law in practice rather than law in statute.